A single photograph can unravel an empire. Lorenzo Manzoni ruthlessly ruled the city's underworld, trusting no one after his brother's brutal murder. But when he rescued a bleeding woman from the pouring rain, he didn't know he was bringing his brother's darkest, deadliest secret straight into his own home. The rain in Chicago that November night didn't just fall, it hammered against the pavement like it was trying to wash away the sins of the city. Lorenzo Manzoni sat in the back of his armored Cadillac Escalade, nursing a glass of bourbon that mirrored the amber glow of the passing streetlights. At 32, Lorenzo was the undisputed head of the Manzoni crime syndicate. He was a man made of cold calculations and ruthless efficiency, traits that had only sharpened in the 6 months since his younger brother Nico had been gunned down in a seemingly random drive-by shooting. The police called it a tragic case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Lorenzo knew better. In their world, there were no coincidences. But despite tearing the city apart, interrogating rival bosses, and leaving a trail of broken men in his wake, he was no closer to finding the truth. The ghost of Nico haunted the leather seats of his cars, the grand halls of his Lake Forest estate, and the quiet, agonizing moments before sleep. Take the alleyway past the old Fulton Market warehouses. Carmine, Lorenzo instructed his driver, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that commanded instant obedience. I want to see if the shipments from the docks are secured. Carmine, a burly enforcer who had been with the family for 2 decades, nodded and spun the heavy steering wheel. The SUV dipped into the poorly lit, narrow service roads. The headlights cut through the torrential downpour, illuminating dumpsters, discarded pallets, and the overflowing gutters. Then, the beams caught movement. 50 yards ahead, 3 men had someone cornered against the brick wall of an abandoned textile factory. Even through the distorted, rain-slicked, bulletproof glass, Lorenzo could see the violence. One man had his hand wrapped around the victim's hair, pulling violently, while another delivered a brutal kick to their ribs. Normally, Lorenzo would look away. The underworld was a brutal ecosystem, and intervening in street-level squabbles was beneath a man of his stature. But as the victim slumped to the ground, the headlights caught a flash of soaked, auburn hair, and a pale face turned toward the glaring lights. It was a woman. Her eyes, wide and completely devoid of hope, met the blinding lights of the Escalade. Something inside Lorenzo's chest tightened, an unfamiliar, sharp twist of instinct. "Stop the car," Lorenzo ordered. Carmine hit the brakes, the heavy vehicle sliding slightly on the wet asphalt. "Boss, it's not our business. Could be a setup." "I said stop the car," Lorenzo repeated, his hand already reaching for the heavy iron of the customized 1911 pistol tucked into his shoulder holster. He didn't wait for Carmine to put the car in park before he pushed his door open, stepping out into the freezing deluge. The rain instantly soaked his tailored charcoal suit, but he didn't care. Carmine and his bodyguard Dante scrambled out seconds later, weapons drawn, but Lorenzo was already moving. The 3 attackers froze, blinded by the headlights and stunned by the sudden appearance of 3 armed men in high-end suits. As Lorenzo stepped into the halo of the headlights, the leader of the thugs squinted, and then all the color drained from his face. Everyone in the city knew the sharp jawline, the piercing dark eyes, and the chilling aura of Lorenzo Manzoni. "Manzoni!" the man breathed, taking a staggering step back. "You have exactly 3 seconds to disappear into the sewer you crawled out of," Lorenzo said, his voice barely rising above the sound of the rain, yet carrying a lethal promise. "Before I decide to keep you here permanently." They didn't need to be told twice. The men scrambled, slipping on the wet pavement as they sprinted down the alley, vanishing into the shadows of the city. Lorenzo didn't bother watching them run. He holstered his weapon and knelt beside the woman. She was curled into a tight ball, shivering violently. Her clothes, a simple, torn trench coat and a cheap blouse, were soaked through with a mixture of rain and her own blood. A deep laceration above her brow was bleeding freely, the crimson washing down her cheek. Lorenzo reached out, his large, calloused hand gently touching her shoulder. She flinched violently, a whimper escaping her bruised lips as she tried to scramble away, her back pressing hard against the rough brick. "I'm not going to hurt you," Lorenzo said, keeping his voice uncharacteristically soft. "They're gone." She blinked through the blood and rain, her green eyes unfocused, wild with terror. She tried to speak, but only a ragged gasp came out. Then her eyes rolled back, and she collapsed against the pavement, completely unconscious. "Boss?" Dante asked, stepping up behind him, his gun still scanning the rooftops. "Do we call the paramedics?" "No," Lorenzo said, a strange possessive instinct taking over. If those men were trying to kill her, a public hospital would be a death sentence. "Call Dr. Harrison. Tell him to meet us at the estate immediately. Get her in the car." For the next 2 days, the sprawling, heavily fortified Mancini estate became a makeshift hospital. Dr. Arthur Harrison, a brilliant surgeon who had lost his license years ago and found highly lucrative employment with the syndicate, worked tirelessly. 3 broken ribs, a severe concussion, multiple contusions, and signs of severe malnourishment. Lorenzo found himself drawn to the guest room in the West Wing more often than he cared to admit. He would stand in the doorway, a glass of whiskey in hand, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of her chest hooked up to the monitors. She looked incredibly fragile, a stark contrast to the hardened, violent world he inhabited. He had his men run facial recognition, check missing persons reports, and scour the city's databases. Nothing came back. It was as if she didn't exist. On the 3rd evening, she finally woke up. Lorenzo was sitting in a leather wing-back chair in the corner of her room, reading a ledger, when he heard the rustle of the silk sheets. He looked up. She was staring at the ornate ceiling, her brow furrowed in confusion, before her eyes darted around the opulent room, finally landing on him. Panic immediately flooded her features. She tried to sit up, but a sharp cry of pain escaped her as her broken ribs protested. "Don't move," Lorenzo said, standing up slowly so as not to startle her. He walked to the edge of the bed. "You're safe. You're at my home. I'm Lorenzo." She looked at him, her chest heaving. "The alley. The men. Dealt with," he lied smoothly. They had run, but he would find them eventually. "Who are you? What did you do to have a hit squad beating you to death in my territory?" She swallowed hard, looking away. Her fingers gripped the edge of the blanket. "My name is Chloe Jenkins." The hesitation in her voice was microscopic, but Lorenzo made his living detecting lies. It was a fake name. "Well, Chloe Jenkins," Lorenzo said, leaning in slightly, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "You have no ID, no wallet, and my men can't find a single record of you existing in Chicago. You're hiding from someone. I suggest you tell me who, before I decide that keeping you alive is a liability." "I don't remember," she whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I swear, I don't remember why they were chasing me." Lorenzo stared at her for a long, silent moment. The amnesia act was classic, but the raw terror in her eyes felt genuine. Against his better judgment, the icy fortress around his heart cracked just a fraction. "Rest," he commanded softly, turning toward the door. "But understand this, Chloe. In my house, secrets are dangerous things to keep." A week passed. Chloe's physical wounds began to heal under the meticulous care of Dr. Harrison and Lorenzo's private staff, but the invisible walls around her only grew higher, She was quiet, polite, and deeply guarded. She spent her days sitting by the massive bay windows of the guest suite, staring out at the manicured grounds and the imposing iron gates that kept the world out. Lorenzo, meanwhile, was consumed by his own demons. The anniversary of Nico's death was rapidly approaching, bringing with it a suffocating wave of grief and rage. The streets were getting restless. The Romano Syndicate, a brutal rival faction operating out of the south side, had been pushing into Mancini territory, sensing a weakness in Lorenzo's continued distraction over his brother's unsolved murder. Late one night, unable to sleep, Lorenzo retreated to his private study. The room was a sanctuary of dark mahogany, wall-to-wall books, and the heavy scent of expensive cigar smoke. He poured himself a generous measure of Macallan 25 and walked over to a heavy iron safe hidden behind an oil painting. He spun the dial, the mechanical clicks echoing in the silent room. Inside, sitting on the bottom shelf, was a sealed, brown cardboard evidence box. It had been returned to him by a corrupt precinct captain 2 months ago. It contained the personal effects Nico had on him the night he was murdered. Lorenzo had never opened it. The thought of touching the last things his brother had held had been too agonizing. But tonight, the whiskey and the suffocating silence of the mansion pushed him over the edge. He needed to feel close to Nico. He needed a clue, a sign, anything to point his vengeance in the right direction. He carried the box to his massive oak desk, broke the police seal with a silver letter opener, and opened the flaps. The sterile smell of a police locker drifted up. Inside lay Nico's shattered Rolex Daytona, its hands frozen at 11:42 p.m., the exact time of death. Next to it was his silver Zippo lighter, his keys, and a few blood-stained receipts. And finally, Nico's wallet. It was a custom-made black leather bifold, given to him by Lorenzo for his 21st birthday. The leather was stiff, ruined by dried blood that had soaked into the stitching. Lorenzo picked it up, his hand trembling slightly. The tactile reality of the dried blood made his chest tighten. He opened it. The police had already emptied the cash and credit cards, leaving only the empty slots. But Lorenzo knew his brother better than anyone. He knew the wallet's design intimately because he had ordered it himself from a craftsman in Milan. Nico always had secrets, and he always used the hidden compartment. Lorenzo ran his thumb along the seam behind the billfold area. He pressed a specific pressure point on the leather lining, and a nearly invisible magnetic clasp released. A hidden flap dropped down. Inside, tucked away perfectly, was a single, slightly faded Polaroid photograph. Lorenzo pulled it out, holding it under the warm light of his desk lamp. His heart stopped. The breath vanished from his lungs, as if he had been punched by a heavyweight. In the photograph, Nico was smiling. It wasn't his usual arrogant Mafia prince smirk. It was a genuine, radiant, boyish smile that Lorenzo hadn't seen in years. His arm was wrapped protectively around a woman. They were standing on a beach, the wind catching her auburn hair, her face turned toward Nico, laughing at something he had just said. Her green eyes were bright, full of life, and an undeniable, profound love. It was Chloe, the bleeding, terrified stranger sleeping 50 feet away in his guest wing. The woman who claimed she had no past, no identity, and no memory of how she ended up in Chicago. Lorenzo's hand shook so violently that the photograph nearly slipped from his fingers. He flipped it over. On the back, written in Nico's messy, familiar scrawl, were the words, "To my forever, my saving grace." Immo. The silence in the study was deafening. The pieces of the puzzle began violently snapping into place, forming a picture so horrifying it made Lorenzo's blood run cold. Nico hadn't been killed in a random hit. He had been targeted. And this woman, this Chloe, was right at the center of it. Was she a honeypot? A spy sent by the Romanos to get close to his brother and set him up? Or was she just a tragic casualty of Nico trying to protect a civilian from his violent world? The amnesia, the fake name, the hit squad trying to silence her in the alley. It all pointed to one undeniable fact. She knew exactly what happened the night Nico died, and she had been lying to Lorenzo since the moment she opened her eyes. A dark, blinding rage eclipsed Lorenzo's grief. He slammed the whiskey glass onto the desk, the crystal shattering into a dozen pieces, the amber liquid pooling over the police reports. He grabbed the photograph, shoved his customized 1911 pistol into his waistband, and stormed out of the study. His heavy footsteps echoed like gunshots down the grand marble hallway. He bypassed the guards, ignoring their startled expressions, and marched straight to the West Wing. He didn't knock. Lorenzo threw open the heavy oak door to the guest suite. Chloe was sitting up in bed, reading a book by the light of a bedside lamp. She jumped at the sudden, violent intrusion, the book tumbling from her lap. When she saw Lorenzo's face, a mask of pure, murderous fury, she instinctively scrambled backward, pressing herself against the headboard, her eyes wide with terror. "Lorenzo!" she stammered, her voice trembling. What's wrong?" He crossed the room in 3 massive strides, closing the distance between them. He didn't say a word. He simply raised his hand and violently slammed the Polaroid photograph onto the nightstand, right under the circle of the lamp's light. Chloe looked down. For a split second, the room was completely still. Then, Lorenzo watched it happen. He watched the lie shatter. He saw the exact moment the manufactured confusion melted away, replaced by a devastating, agonizing recognition. All the color drained from her face, leaving her as pale as a ghost. A strangled, broken sob tore from her throat as she stared at Nico's smiling face. She knew him. She remembered everything. Lorenzo leaned over her, his hands gripping the edges of the mattress, trapping her. The smell of his expensive cologne mixed with the faint, metallic scent of gunpowder. "No more lies, Chloe, or whatever the hell your real name is," Lorenzo snarled, his voice a lethal, vibrating whisper that promised unspeakable violence. "You have 60 seconds to tell me exactly how you know my dead brother. And if I don't like the answer, you're going to wish I had left you to die in that alley. My real name is Harper," she choked out, her voice trembling so hard, the words barely made it past her lips. "Harper Sullivan." Lorenzo didn't move. His tall frame blocked the only exit, casting a long, terrifying shadow over the bed. The photograph of his dead brother and this bruised, battered woman seemed to burn a hole through the mahogany nightstand. "Harper," he repeated, tasting the name, testing it for falsehoods. And how exactly does a Harper Sullivan get her hands wrapped around the neck of the Mancini Syndicate's heir? I didn't know who he was at first," Harper pleaded, pulling the silk sheets up to her chin as if they could offer protection against a man like Lorenzo. "We met a year ago. I was working as a florist for a charity gala at the Palmer House Hotel downtown. Nico was there. He bumped into me, ruined a centerpiece, and insisted on buying me coffee to make up for it. He told me he was in real estate." Lorenzo let out a harsh, humorless laugh. Nico's version of real estate usually involved burning out the tenants first. "He wasn't like that with me," Harper fired back, a sudden flash of defensive anger cutting through her terror. It was the first real emotion Lorenzo had seen from her that wasn't pure fear. He was kind. He was gentle. For 6 months, I had no idea about the syndicate, about you, about any of the blood. By the time I found out, I was already in love with him. Lorenzo's jaw clenched tight enough to crack his teeth. He wanted to call her a liar. He wanted to drag her out by her hair and hand her over to his interrogators. But the genuine, agonizing grief in her green eyes mirrored the hollow cavern in his own chest. "If you loved him," Lorenzo growled, leaning in closer, "then why were you running? Why did you hide from me when you woke up in my house?" Harper closed her eyes, a fresh wave of tears spilling over her bruised cheeks. "Because Nico told me to never, ever trust you. He said you were too deep in the life, that you would never understand." She took a ragged breath. "Nico was trying to get out, Lorenzo. He was done with the violence. We were going to disappear. He had bought a small farmhouse in Tuscany under a dummy corporation. We were supposed to leave the night he was killed." The words hit Lorenzo like a physical blow. Nico, leaving? His loyal, blood-bound brother abandoning the family? It didn't make sense. But then, looking at the faded Polaroid, seeing the absolute peace on Nico's face, a terrible realization began to dawn on him. "The Romanos killed him," Lorenzo stated, though for the first time in 6 months, his absolute certainty wavered. "They caught him on the south side." "It wasn't the Romanos," Harper whispered, her eyes opening to meet his, filled with a dark, terrifying truth. "It was Dominic Russo." Lorenzo froze. The name hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Dominic Russo was his underboss, his right-hand man, the man who had stood beside Lorenzo at Nico's funeral, swearing bloody vengeance. "Be very careful with your next words, Harper," Lorenzo said, his voice dropping to a deadly, vibrating baritone. "You are accusing my second-in-command of murdering my blood. Nico found out Dominic was stealing from you," Harper explained rapidly, panic rising in her chest. "Millions of dollars from the waterfront shipments funneled into offshore accounts. Nico was gathering the proof. He was going to bring it to you before we left. But Dominic found out. He ambushed Nico that night. I was supposed to meet him at the corner of Clark and Division. I saw Dominic's men box his car in. I saw the flashes of the guns." She broke down, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently. "I ran. Nico told me if anything ever happened, I had to run. I had the flash drive with all the offshore account ledgers. I put it in a safety deposit box at the Chase Bank on Dearborn. Dominic has been hunting me ever since. Those men in the alley, they were Dominic's." Lorenzo stood completely still, his mind racing. The pieces clicked together with horrifying precision. Dominic had been the one pushing hardest for a war with the Romanos, diverting Lorenzo's attention. Dominic was the one who managed the waterfront shipments. Before Lorenzo could speak, before he could process the sheer magnitude of the betrayal, a sound shattered the quiet of the estate. It wasn't a loud explosion, but a heavy, muffled thump, followed instantly by the shattering of reinforced glass from the floor below. Then came the unmistakable, rapid-fire staccato of suppressed automatic weapons. The security alarms didn't blare. The lights didn't flash. "He's here," Lorenzo realized, his blood running like ice water. Dominic oversaw the estate's security grid. He had disabled the alarms. He knew exactly where Harper was. Lorenzo instantly kicked into survival mode. The grief and betrayal were shoved into a dark corner of his mind, replaced by the cold, calculating predator that had kept him alive this long. He drew his .45 ACP from his waistband, chambering around with a sharp, metallic clack. "Get out of the bed!" he barked at Harper. She froze, paralyzed by the sound of boots pounding up the grand marble staircase down the hall. "I said move!" Lorenzo roared, grabbing her arm and hauling her out of the bed. She cried out as her broken ribs flared with agony, but Lorenzo didn't have time for bedside manner. He dragged her toward the heavy mahogany wardrobe at the far end of the room. "Get in," he ordered, throwing the doors open and pushing her behind the rack of heavy winter coats. "Do not make a sound. If I don't come back to open these doors, you wait until it's silent, you climb out the window, and you run into the woods. Do you understand?" Harper nodded frantically, her eyes wide with sheer terror. Lorenzo slammed the wardrobe door shut, just as the heavy oak door to the guest suite was kicked open, splintering off its hinges. 3 men in tactical black stormed into the room, their suppressed submachine guns sweeping the shadows. Lorenzo didn't hesitate. Stepping out from the archway, his .45 ACP raised, he fired 3 consecutive deafening shots. The first round slammed into the lead man's Kevlar vest, the sheer kinetic force dropping him instantly. The second man's head snapped back in a spray of crimson before he could even aim. The third mercenary managed a wild burst, bullets chewing into the plaster inches from Lorenzo's face, showering him in white dust. Lorenzo pivoted smoothly, aiming down the sights, and put a round through the third man's throat. The attacker collapsed onto the Persian rug. Lorenzo didn't stop to admire his work. He stepped over the bleeding bodies, moving swiftly into the hallway. His grand estate had transformed into a war zone. Down below in the opulent foyer, he could hear Carmine shouting orders, exchanging heavy fire with a dozen of Dominic's loyalists. The acrid smell of cordite and copper filled the air, completely overpowering the usual scent of lemon polish. "Lorenzo!" a voice echoed up the grand marble staircase. Lorenzo ducked behind a thick column just as a hail of bullets shattered the massive crystal chandelier above. It crashed to the floor in a devastating, glittering explosion. "It's over, Lorenzo." Dominic Russo's voice drifted up, dripping with arrogant confidence. "Carmine is pinned down. Half your security detail is dead. Give me the girl, and I'll make this quick for you, out of respect for our history." A dark, lethal calm settled over Lorenzo. His brother's killer was standing in his home, demanding the very woman Nico had died to protect. The rage inside him didn't burn hot. It burned absolute zero. "You talk too much, Dominic," Lorenzo called back, his voice echoing eerily in the cavernous, smoke-filled space. "You always did. It's exactly why Nico caught you slipping." A tense silence fell over the foyer. Dominic realized the truth was out. "Nico was weak!" Dominic shouted, finally dropping his composed facade. "He wanted to leave the Empire for some street-level florist. He was a massive liability. I did you a favor, Lorenzo." Lorenzo peered around the edge of the marble pillar. Through the haze, he spotted Dominic taking cover behind a heavy oak credenza near the front doors, reloading his weapon. 2 of his men were cautiously advancing up the stairs. Lorenzo leaned out and fired, dropping the first man on the stairs with a clean shot to the chest. The second man returned fire, forcing Lorenzo back into cover. "Covering fire!" Dominic yelled to his remaining men. Lorenzo knew he was outgunned, with only 6 rounds left in his magazine, but he also knew this house better than anyone on Earth. He slipped backward, moving silently down the second-floor corridor toward his private study. He kicked the door open, darted inside, and went straight for the hidden compartment behind his desk. Pressing the concealed latch, he retrieved a sleek, fully loaded, short-barreled shotgun. He pumped the action, the mechanical sound deafening. He didn't return to the stairs. Instead, he stepped out onto the second-floor interior balcony that overlooked the foyer from the rear. Dominic and his men were entirely focused on the front staircase, anticipating Lorenzo's return from that angle. Lorenzo looked down at the man who had stood by his side for a decade, the man who had sworn loyalty, only to put a bullet in his little brother. Lorenzo aimed the heavy shotgun over the mahogany railing. "Dominic!" Dominic spun around, looking up, his eyes widening in pure horror as he stared down the barrel of the weapon. He raised his gun, but he was a fraction of a second too late. Lorenzo pulled the trigger. The blast echoed like thunder. The buckshot caught Dominic square in the chest, lifting him off his feet and throwing him violently backward through the shattered glass of the front doors. He landed on the wet stone of the driveway, completely motionless. Seeing their leader decimated, the remaining men dropped their weapons, raising their hands in surrender to Carmine, who emerged from the dining room with a bleeding shoulder, but a steady rifle. "Tie them up," Lorenzo ordered coldly, staring down at Dominic's lifeless body. "Take them to the warehouse. I'll deal with them later." The estate fell utterly silent, save for the patter of the rain against the broken windows. The vengeance Lorenzo had craved for 6 months was finally his. But it didn't bring Nico back. He turned and walked slowly back to the guest wing. When he opened the wardrobe doors, Harper was curled into a ball in the corner, her hands clamped over her ears, weeping silently. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for a sign of her fate. Lorenzo reached out his hand, wiping the drywall dust on his slacks before offering it to her. "It's over," Lorenzo said softly. "Dominic is dead." Harper took his hand. He pulled her up, steadying her as she swayed. She looked at him, seeing past the ruthless mob boss to the broken brother underneath. In a sudden, desperate movement, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his waist, burying her face in his chest. Lorenzo stiffened. Slowly, tentatively, he wrapped his arms around her trembling shoulders, pulling her close. She was Nico's greatest secret, and now she was Lorenzo's greatest responsibility. "Tomorrow, we go to the Chase Bank," Lorenzo murmured into her hair, his eyes hardening. "We get the ledger, and then we tear out every last root Dominic planted. You aren't running anymore, Harper. You're a Mancini now, and no one touches a Mancini. What a wild, adrenaline-fueled ride. From a bleeding stranger in an alley to uncovering the ultimate betrayal within the Mafia ranks, Lorenzo and Harper's story is proof that the darkest secrets always come to light. If you loved this intense, twist-filled Mafia romance drama, hit that like button, share it with your fellow story lovers, and don't forget to subscribe for more gripping, real-life inspired tales. Let us know in the comments. What do you think Lorenzo will do next?